As anybody who has watched this show and this network will know, Africa has become the hot spot for U.S. investors recently. This is due to the global commodities boom and innovations in developing natural resources. Certain sectors such as oil and gas, financial services, agriculture, and hospitality are offering the most opportunities for investors, says our next guest, David Rice. He is the director of AfriCapitalism Institute, a Pan-African think tank based in Nigeria. He joins us here in New York. You were at the Clinton Initiative. You've been to the UN talking about what's going on there. What are you hearing coming out of there about the investment activity in Africa, which continues, from what I understand, pretty strong?
It's very strong. You know, Africa is home right now to 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. And that's often overlooked because the media often tends to focus on some of the crises that tend to get a lot of attention. But the story underneath that is really one where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, and the flow of capital to the continent from remittances and from private investors far outweighs the flow from charitable interests.
Yeah, and if you look at the global forecast, you know, we have Europe hitting a recession, the U.S. economy is coming back slowly, but Africa continues to really be particularly strong. Where in Africa are you looking the most at investments?
Well, Nigeria is the obvious choice.
Which is now the biggest economy.
Biggest economy. They have tremendous.
They had to recalculate their GDP to get there, but they are the biggest economy.
They did. You know, when with the largest population, a young working age population, a lot of untapped opportunity, both in natural resources, in agriculture, and financial services. It's a natural choice. South Africa is obviously still a perennial favorite. But on the emergent side, you have Tanzania, which has huge natural gas deposits, almost as much as Russia. You have Ghana, which also has a robust energy sector. And then the outlier, and some people may be surprised at this, I think is the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Interesting.
It's because of the inherent challenges that are there that it's the really savvy investor that is going to get in early and has a chance to make a real positive return.
No pain, no gain, right? The bigger risk you take. And if you track historically and looked at other countries that went through that, it could be a pretty decent bet. You never know. You know, the hit on Africa has been that it has really been a commodities-based economy for too long. And we talk about the developments. You know, are the utilities getting to where they have to be? Are the financial sectors getting there? Are they making this transition? And when you talk about Africa, I understand it's a big continent.
Right. Well, you know, we preach this philosophy of AfriCapitalism, which is that in order for the continent to develop, you have to rely more on the private sector. And so, you know, in relation to what you said earlier about the conversation at the UN, there's a lot of discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the next iteration of the Millennium Development Goals. And there isn't enough private sector emphasis within that discussion. And so that's part of what we try to do, is we bring to the conversation the perspective of the private sector, not just as a place for domestic and foreign investors to generate a return, but also to build greater prosperity on the continent.
If Americans are interested in investing, and talk about retail investors, should they be looking at American companies doing business in Africa, or can they start to take more risks and actually invest directly into African companies?
I think you have to look directly at African companies. I mean, frankly, the U.S. investor community still hasn't completely woken up to the idea. I mean, the Obama administration had the U.S.-Africa Summit just back in August. And that's just the start of a conversation that has to happen.
Which, by the way, was tremendously attended. I mean, bringing people here was a brilliant idea.
Yeah, I mean, and you saw leaders like Tony Elumelu, you saw Patrice Motsepe, you saw these African entrepreneurs who are finally getting onto the radar of the global investor community because they're obviously from there and they've proven that they know how to make money there.
We could talk about Ebola and that there's a risk there, hopefully a short-term one. But what about the long-term political risk? How do you evaluate that? Well,
with each passing election cycle, there's a growing confidence in the democratic institutions that have emerged on the continent. So it's really more about the institutions than the personalities themselves. And even for Nigeria, it's going to have an election in February. Everyone's watching. And I think that you'll see a lot of really encouraging developments in that respect, that the most populous country on the continent is going to have free, fair, and credible elections. And that sends a really important message to the rest of the continent.
And you see more and more investors, in about 15 seconds left, actually going to Africa and looking at what they want to invest in?
Investors are so interested, and the opportunities are so great that they're still coming despite some of these challenges that are still ongoing.
Okay, David Rice, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very interesting. We'll have you back on to talk more.